You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. And in this episode, I'm joined by my friend and colleague as co-host, Carrie Anderson. We speak to three great experts on what's happening in Iran, how we got here, and what comes next. Before I let them introduce themselves, some important information. This episode is brought to you by Victus Technologies. Victus builds resilient navigation and contested environment autonomy for unmanned, manned, and robotic systems. MIT-born, venture-backed, and led by former SOCOM aviators and engineers, Victus delivers mission-ready autonomy for the world's most challenging environments. In the middle of this episode, I have a very short interview with Jesse Hamill, the Air Force veteran who founded the company. Learn more about Victus at warontherocks.com/Victus. That's VICTUS. Please enjoy the show.
Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C.
Holly Digers, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and Curator of the Iranist Substack.
Nason Rafati, Senior Iran Analyst at the International Crisis Group.
So Carrie and I very much appreciate you all joining us to talk about these fast-moving events in Iran. A lot's changing very quickly. So just for our listeners, we are recording this on Wednesday. And where things currently stand is we still have a carrier group in the Persian Gulf. And we have supposedly nuclear talks, maybe or maybe not, about to start or starting with the Iranians. We don't really know. All this could change by the time this comes out. Hopefully we'll get this out tomorrow on Thursday, but it might be Friday. But I would like to start earlier on and how we should look at what's going on more historically. And Holly, maybe you can help us on this. This isn't the first time there's been sort of popular resistance against the regime.
It's been a headline on and off for, I would say, a few years now. It started with the December 2017, January 2018 protests that actually ironically started because hardliners in Mashhad at the time had chanted against then President Hassan Rouhani. And what they caused was actually unprecedented levels of protest in Iran, the largest in terms of geography since the 1979. And at the heart of that, I think you start to realize from one of the protest chants at the time that hardliners, reformists, the game is over. And so there was a real sense of disillusionment with the clerical establishment. And so we've seen that carry on since. We had the 2019 November protests known as Bloody November, in which Reuters reported at the time that 1,500 protesters were killed under the dark cover of an internet shutdown. And then more famously, it came to head in 2022 with the Women Life Freedom uprising. And now, yet again, here we are with another uprising and all of these, I would say, had explicit calls for the ouster of the Islamic Republic. But the underlining issues at hand were systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression. So while the triggers in each instance was different, those core issues remain the same.
Well, and I think one of the big questions, because as Holly noted, there have been multiple cases in the past of large-scale protests in Iran, and yet this one has felt different. And so maybe we can start with Alex on what do you think makes this case different from the past, or what are maybe some of the similarities?
I would just point out that, the Islamic Republic has had to deal with protests pretty much from day one. So about half a century of engaging in repression. That's why the regime is in power. It used to be that people would come out every 10 years. If we just take Ali Khamenei, the current supreme leader, he dealt with the first set of protests, ironically enough, in his hometown of Mashhad in 1991, 2 years after he became the supreme leader. So he's been doing this for a long time. But what we've also seen in terms of trends, they're becoming more widespread. It used to be pockets in Tehran or Isfahan. Now, in this latest round, we've seen small towns in Kermanshah province, down southwest. I mean, places that you wouldn't imagine are associated with sort of political mobilization. So that, to me, suggests that anger is getting deeper. It's genuinely a case of nationwide protest. And the idea that North Tehran is upset and they're in the streets no longer holds. This is not about North Tehran. This isn't about a middle class that, wants to live a certain lifestyle. This is about deep-seated anger across society. And it's not, to Holly's point, it's not just about one or two issues. It's a long list of grievances. The other part that stands out is how bloody it's become. I mean, the numbers are staggering. We're still waiting to see what the final count will be. But we're talking thousands and thousands of people here at the very least, if not tens of thousands of people. In Iranian history, there's no precedent for that. Even in Middle Eastern, you have to kind of look at Assad, what he did in Hama in 82 in Syria, really kind of systematic machine gunning your own people down. And the worst thing for me is Ali Khamenei, going back to 91 all the way to today, has always said the same thing. It's a foreign plot. It's a foreign plot. Now, I'm not for a second going to sit here and say US or Israel or somebody else didn't or does not have an interest in what happens in Iran. Of course they do. But when I'm looking at the footage of the people mourning their family members being killed, the idea that all these people somehow were recruited by Mossad or some other foreign intelligence service just does not add up to me. And here we are listening to Khamenei's speech just a few days ago. He literally went out of his way to belittle those who were killed. He was making fun of them. He taunted the families. Trump said he would come to your aid. He didn't. And he got a good laughter in that crowd that were there for that speech. It's tragic. Yes, I take away from the recent events that the regime is still ruthless and able to kill. But at the same time, the other trend is that people are coming out in greater and greater numbers, and this regime just doesn't have a solution. It's buying time, killing people for the sake of it. It doesn't really know where it's going. And that's, again, another tragedy stuck. Maybe the death of Khamenei, who's 86, will be the turning point, but that's a maybe. Something could be worse after him. Who knows? But there you have it.
Sure, and I agree with Alex and Holly's views, but I think there's one more thing that we can add, which is that, this is the first set of protests where there's not just been this uprising from below, but a threat of intervention from abroad. In the 2009 protests, in the 2017, 18, 19, 2022 protests, there was condemnation, there was sanctions, but a few days into the uprising that began in late December, President Trump also put the threat of U.S. involvement in, which is a dynamic we had not seen before. And I think, one of the things that's striking about what we've seen over the past 5 weeks at the time of recording is that you almost have this convergence of two dynamics that have been going on for nearly 5 decades, not just 5 weeks. One is this divide between Iranian state and Iranian society, and the other one is the hostility between the Islamic Republic and the United States.
Let's dig into that in terms of how we got here. Talk to me about the mixture, and any of you can jump in here. Talk to me about the mixture of Iranian corruption, mismanagement of the state, extremism, diversion of resources to proxies, et cetera, also with on the other side, U.S. sanctions, sanctions from lots of other countries too, to help create this situation where Iranian society was ripe for an uprising.
It reminds me of when I was traveling with my father about 20 years ago in Dubai, and he said to me, I came here as a young man in the 60s. There was nothing here. And look at Dubai, and that's the story you hear from Iranians. This thing that in 1979, many ways, Iran was sort of put in a bubble. Things froze. There hasn't been development. The rest of the region, they look at and they see, my God, look at the Saudis, look at the Emiratis, look at everybody else planning for the post-oil economies. And here's Iran trying to desperately send discounted oil to the Chinese just to survive. Never mind thriving, just to survive as a regime, by the way. And vast majority of people are suffering as a result of the, I think, ideological policy preferences of this regime. Let's take the elephant in the room, this Islamic Republic's position on Israel. There is nothing in Iranian national interest that suggests to me you should put everything in that basket of fighting Israel forever and ever, unless it's an ideological one. And here's where the regime's lost a long time ago, vast majority of people. They don't buy into the ideology, because if they were so good, how are they so corrupt at home? The corruption, by the way, which is really a major source of anger in Iranian society. It's a society, it's a ruling elite that openly in Farsi, they come out and say, one of us and one of them. The society is divided into supporters and the ones who don't support the regime. And here's the data that I think is very telling. The supporters probably are about 15%, 20% max of Iranian society. So you got a clear majority who want change. And at the top of this pyramid, Khamenei, since 1989, has refused to listen to his own people. Again, going back to this thing that this is a foreign plot. So it's not just foreign policy. Take corruption. Every time there's a big scandal in Iranian society involving corruption, what does Khamenei say? Does he come out and ask for, let's investigate this and make sure this doesn't happen again? No, he says, don't dwell on it. Don't talk about it, because the foreigners are going to take pleasure from our problems. That's not someone who's got solutions for the future of Iran.
Yeah, ironically, it seems, and before I say this, I'm not defending Chinese Communist Party, but it seems like even Xi Jinping is more publicly at least concerned or feigns concern about corruption when he announces this sort of purges or when people get caught in corruption than the Islamic Republic in Iran. It's remarkable.
On the topic of corruption, I mean, I think we saw it play out even during the 12-day war. If you remember, the top military brass, when they were hit those first 24 or 48 hours, what was the pictures that were going viral? The fact that all of them lived in penthouses in Tehran. And people were like, oh, you guys tell us to resist, but you're resisting from your penthouses. I remember somebody posting on social media at the time.
Which are a lot easier to blow up without collateral damage than other units in a building.
Indeed. And so, I mean, so I spent my formative years in Iran, and I remember so many of the conversations. Even the random taxi driver would be like, see that building? It's owned by so-and-so. And often it was former President Ali Akbar Rafsanjani. The Rafsanjani had a lot of wealth, and wasn't he in Forbes or something as one of the richest clerics or something? I don't remember.
He was on the cover of one of the American magazines. I think it was Forbes or Time.
Yeah, as being one of the wealthiest clerics or something, just to give you a sense. But it's that corruption. And thanks to the internet and social media, Iranians have been able to see how, as they were known at the time, thanks to a special Instagram account, the rich kids of Tehran live. And these were the elites' children. Some of them looked just like us. They were driving Western luxury cars. They were shopping in Dubai. And they were living their best lives in Tehran. And it was stuff like that young Iranians especially were seeing and saying, well, I can't even find a job. I'm an engineer that has to drive a taxi and I can hardly make ends meet. But this person here is driving a Ferrari. And so that it really it unsettled Iranians. And it was really that's what played a big role in their frustration. And then the other side of the coin was, thanks to the internet and satellite dishes, they started learning that, hey, the money that belongs to the Iranian people is being spent on proxies and propping up the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. And so one of the popular chants for more than a decade now is no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, our lives for Iran. And it was because they felt that the wealth of the Iranian people was being spent elsewhere. And so that really spoke to Iranians, these frustrations. And as Alex noted, they haven't really done anything to actually address the corruption. They'll sometimes arrest people. There was a real push right before the Ibrahim Raisi presidency to crack down on corruption, but it was more symbolic in nature. There wasn't, because if that were the case, we would have seen actual reforms being made.
I remember it being very factional. So the Raisi crowd went after their political opponents more than anything else, which is, to use the vehicle of anti-corruption as a way of scoring political points.
Well, I think that there are elements within the system that realize that, this is a problem, that corruption is a problem, mismanagement is a problem, sanctions is a problem. Rouhani raised the ire of the IRGC back in 2015 when the nuclear deal originally happened and said, look, it's not a question of being friends with the West. It's not a matter of being an ally of the United States. It's a question of at least not having adversarial relations where we can actually have access to Western markets, Western companies, because if they're not there, who is? Khatam al-Anbiya or other IRGC conglomerates that get the contract, charge more and produce less. And even under the current administration, Pezeshkian, the one thing you can say about him is that he at least acknowledges the extent of the problems, even if he isn't able to deliver on any of the solutions. But, the fact that inflation is running above 40%, trade is, especially in terms of oil, there are still barrels going. How much of that revenue is repatriated is unclear, and who repatriates it, coming to Alex's point about the middlemen and the sanctions merchants, as they call them in Persian. The lack of investment in infrastructure, right? A country that is one of the richest nations on earth in terms of natural resources, gas and oil, consistently has power outages in the summer, power outages in the winter, environmental concerns, flooding, drought, and dam building that is done with no, respect for environmental considerations. All of these things compound into a polycrisis that is social, political, economic, environmental, and at the moment, diplomatic and military as well.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the environmental point, because I do think this is an important one that sometimes gets dropped a bit. And I remember, I believe it was this last summer, that the president himself was suggesting that Tehran might run out of water. And basically, that he had no solution to it. And this is, of course, obviously part of the related to the corruption and the incompetency and mismanagement, perhaps also sanctions. So I just wanted to throw that out as well as to get your thoughts on what type of a role that's playing now and in the future, because that's obviously not something that's going away.
You know, the thing that stands out for me on the environmental issue is where's the focus of the leadership? When you're focused on rebuilding, South Beirut or South Lebanon, when you're focused on those kinds of projects, at the same time as your foreign policy has created massive amounts of sanctions. Iran today, I think, is the second most sanctioned country on earth after Russia. We're not talking hundreds of billions of dollars. We're talking to the tune of trillions of dollars in lost damages because of sanctions, going back to, the beginning of the revolution in 1979, obviously intensified because of the nuclear issue. So the key for me is that the leadership, they don't pay attention to what the people care about. And when you end up with a system where there's no accountability, and that's the thing. So we're talking about dams before. Who is involved building dams? The wrong places. It's somebody with political connections to the system, to Khamenei. They get away with it, even though when they're ruining livelihoods of people down the stream when it comes to farmers and so on. I could go on, but the environmental issue, it's not just the water, it's the air pollution. Because again, and all of it in many ways go back to this issue of foreign policy isolation, lack of accountability, right? And you have this closed system where, for example, let me give you an example. Iranian-made cars are terrible when it comes to air control. They pollute like they shouldn't in year 2026. And yet it's a closed market and they're connected. So there's this corruption that happens where you don't allow foreign cars to come in. You are politically connected. And you see how these things are all connected, dotted next to one another. And this is just one example. I could go on and give you examples where the environmental issue is literally killing thousands of people that shouldn't be dying. Again, because the policymakers aren't prioritizing the right issues, at least in the minds of the average Iranian today.
On the industrial and infrastructure corruption, a lot of this is very Soviet. I think a lot of scholars and people that are still alive that lived through the Soviet Union would recognize a lot of this.
Absolutely. Let me give you an example. 90% of Iran's water is used for agricultural production. They don't need to use 90% of the water. They could buy goods from nearby places like Kazakhstan, much cheaper prices, right? Why are they investing so much in self-sufficiency when it comes to food? Because their foreign policy has meant that they need to make sure they don't rely on outsiders for food security. So the problem could be fixed by having a different approach to your foreign policy.
On the topic of water, it's extraordinary because they've consistently been messing up. Like we talked about the IRGC and corruption. I mean, they've got what they call a water mafia. Some analysts and activists describe it as such. They've overdammed the country. There's over 600, I think, now. And it's because they're making all these contracts, they're making money, and that's how they're getting rich. And then it's heartbreaking because then you see parts of the country, like in Isfahan, there's been protests by farmers over the years who are then brutally suppressed. And so this isn't something that happened over the past year where you have the president of Iran declaring that Tehran might be running out of water. This has been something that's been ongoing for a long time, and they've been unwilling to address it. And the average Iranian sees its smoke and mirrors because a lot of the clerical establishment likes to blame its problems on sanctions and the West. But over the summer when there were water protests after the 12-day war, I think it was in August, a lot of the retirees and nurses that were out on the streets were saying, you guys blame sanctions, but it's you guys. It's inflation. It's you guys. Like, stop blaming everybody else for our problems when we know it's you and it's your inability to govern. And that's why, just circling back to the original point at the start of this conversation, this is why Iranians don't want this regime anymore. It's because over and over again, they've been unable to provide for the Iranian people.
Let's talk about how the 12-day war created vulnerabilities in the Iranian security apparatus, or did not, or maybe created perceived vulnerabilities in the domestic security apparatus that led to more optimism among the protesters.
Since the 12-day war, I mean, if you pull out the prism and look at the post-October 7th world, Iran has had vulnerabilities in terms of its regional power projection, and then also had vulnerabilities at home. And in terms of the vulnerabilities at home, you can break them down into a couple of different ones. One is massive intelligence penetration and vulnerability. We saw that with the killing of the senior Hamas official Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran on Pezeshkian's inauguration day. We've seen that previously with Israeli assassinations against senior Iranian nuclear scientists. And then we saw that particularly on the first day of the 12-day war. On the 13th of June, there was an Israeli official who told us that as far as we were concerned, this war was in some ways over in the first 5 minutes. The Israelis were able to nearly simultaneously take out the upper ranks of the IRGC and the Iranian military command, and at the same time take out close to a dozen senior Iranian nuclear scientists, right? Operation Red Wedding and Operation Narnia. And to come back to a point that Alex made earlier, nobody has actually lost a job over this in Iran. Nobody in the intelligence ministry, no one in the IRGC who's still around has lost any of this. And so I think that certainly in terms of its regional vulnerability, its vulnerability to air power, especially in the strikes against the Israeli strikes against Iran in June, U.S. strikes on Operation Midnight Hammer, and in terms of its vulnerability in the intelligence services, the record has not been very good for the Iranian system in the last couple of months.
Well, and also I think that gets to the point of what are the regime's options now? We, of course, had the 12-day war in June. We now have all these U.S. military assets in the region. As you've noted, it appears that they have very little public support within their own country. What are their options?
I mean, look, they could decide to do as President Trump is asking them to do, which is basically to give up everything they've done for the last many decades, to pull back from the region, to end their missile program as we know it. And certainly, give up enrichment capabilities. I don't think for a second the Islamic Republic is going to go for all those things in one combination, because not while Khamenei is alive. After him, maybe, but while he's alive, given what we know about the man, he's a very stubborn personality. He knows what's wrong. He knows exactly this could be a pathway forward, and yet he refuses to sort of do it. So what I think the regime essentially is going to end up doing is they're going to give diplomacy another try. At the very best, you might get something similar to 2015 deal, maybe a bit more, because this is Trump and this is not Obama. So Trump needs something that looks slightly better than what was done 10 years ago, 11 years ago. The Iranians, again, there are some reports coming from Russian sources and so on. Some of the enriched material could be shipped to Russia. Enrichment in Iran could happen under Russian supervision. I don't know how much of this is actually true, but it's certainly coming from Russian sources. What I can say is this. We're going back to the lessons learned from the 12-day war. If you had someone in leadership, Khamenei, the senior members of the Revolutionary Guards, who actually decided this is a wake-up call. Because when we're talking about what Iran does in the region, why did the IDF suddenly start dropping bombs over Tehran? They didn't get up one morning and decide that's what they want to do. It goes back to the early 80s. It goes back to the Islamic Republic moving troops over, mobilizing, creating the likes of Hezbollah in Lebanon on Israel's doorsteps, saying, I will eventually destroy you. That's where the fight starts. So you want to really find a solution, you got to go back to the origins, which in my mind are ideological, not based on national interest. And if you take that big decision, the future could be so different looking for this, even this regime in power.
Now I'm going to take a quick break from this episode to talk to Jesse Hamill, the founder and CEO of Victus, and a military veteran as well.
What I saw from my time in the Air Force, from combat operations in Afghanistan, through flight testing at White Sands, through time in Germany and seeing the rise of drone operations, we built up an entire defense apparatus, assuming global positioning system is going to be good to go, and that we'd always have access to medium Earth orbit signals. And that's just not the case anymore. So we invented a way to be able to use any kind of system, robotic system, with its self-contained inertial sensors, not reliant on this invisible Pinocchio string that has to go from Earth or near Earth all the way up to medium Earth orbit. How that frees you for all kinds of operations. What we found is most cases, whether it's quantum sensing, atomic clocks, another constellation low Earth orbit with a laser comm kit, advanced IMUs, and magnometers, that they tend to fail outside of the lab environment. So we build a computer model and it models how, let's say a drone, let's model how it moves in the physical space. We then put that in a high fidelity simulator that looks like a physics-based gaming simulator. And then we train it with a very specific amount of information we're collecting, and then a very specific model to basically help the machine and the computer learn what the GPS should look like and how the accelerometers, which are measuring your movement, how it moves in the physical world, how that looks. And I can change the winds. I can change the different ways we operate it. I can do that all very cheap, very fast. And then the output of that is what we call like a model, but it's basically a piece of software that then goes onto that drone and then performs that question based on how it's been trained of where am I? It answers that question, where am I? And then we monitor the GPS and the basic systems on board. What's been missing in drones and in any kind of platform, airplanes, ships, weapon systems, what's been missing is what I'd call like the inner ear. So right now, if you close your eyes and you tilt your head, you don't get disoriented. You actually know from a gravity shift and this very complex interplay that's happening with your inner ears to your different parts of your brain. You know that your head is moving. You also, if you're in a familiar place, you actually can find yourself around. You know, you don't lose complete orientation when you close your eyes. The robotic systems, including drones that we have right now, they effectively lose all orientation when their eyes are closed. What we're giving them is a basic orientation that's pre-trained, much like an imagination. And then they can literally feel the shifts of accelerometers.
Learn more about Victus at warontherocks.com/Victus, VICTUS. And now, back to the conversation about Iran. As, of course, Khamenei mocked his opponents, Trump did not intervene, at least not yet, on behalf of those standing against the regime. Some of that was timing in terms of what military assets to get into theater. Some of that was choosing not to use the carrier group in the Caribbean for various reasons. Some of that was also choice. Setting all that aside and focusing on the choice, do you think it was a mistake for the United States to not strike sooner? Do you think the U.S. should strike at all? Or just, if you don't want to take a position on that, how do you think we should all think about these issues?
There's two different elements to this, right? What are your means and what are your ends? And, in a policymaking process, you need to match these two. So very early on, I think January 2nd, President Trump said, we will intervene if Iran conducts a crackdown. The Iranian government did conduct a crackdown. It seemed in mid-January that an attack was nearly imminent. And because of that mismatch of means and ends, I think that was postponed, that the president wanted to do something and was told there is a retaliatory risk from Iran.
Reportedly, these not just U.S. forces in the region to defend them, you moving more air defense, but also reportedly, at least, the Israelis asked for more time to prepare.
Well, I think this is one of the differences between some of the other instances where we've seen the U.S. deploy force under President Trump is that they tend to be high-impact mitigated risk operations, right? So whether it's Maduro, whether it's going after Qasem Soleimani in 2020 in the Iranian case, whether it's Operation Midnight Hammer, they are discrete operations with a kind of built-in off-ramp. And when you see campaigns that threaten to become open-ended, like the Houthi naval campaign, they go on for some time, and then there's a moment where the administration says, okay, we're going to make a deal and move on from this because the returns aren't there. So now there are multiple factors going into this, right? One is U.S. credibility. The president has said we will intervene. Iran has violated that red line, and therefore the U.S., the president's position, and certainly some of his advisors are saying if you don't follow up on this, that sets a bad precedent. Then you have the nuclear and missile considerations, which are still there regardless of the 12-day wars. I mean, we saw...
What do you mean by that?
Well, so the nuclear question, the sites have been damaged. The program has not been eliminated. And there have not been inspectors on the ground in 7 months. There's 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that is likely buried but not accounted for. That's part of a much bigger stockpile. In terms of missiles, the Israelis did a lot of damage to both launchers and production. The Iranians have been reconstituting that. So even in late December, before the protests kicked off, Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the U.S., met with President Trump, and they discussed the expansion of Iran's missile program and the continuing concerns over the nuclear activity. So both of those strategic concerns remain. So you have the element of U.S. red lines and credibility. You have the strategic concerns over the nuclear and missile issue. You have the human rights imperative. And then I think you have the bigger prospect of if a country, if a regime that has been the great bête noire of the United States for nearly 5 decades, is in a moment of vulnerability, then is this the moment to also go for the jugular?
So for me, what really stands out is the fact that the president started telling the protesters that help is on the way, take over your institutions, and communicating this. And this is before the communications shut down some of this rhetoric was coming from. And I really firmly believe it was for that reason that you saw, and for other reasons as well, that more people were out on the streets. Before the communications shut down, I've seen videos of Iranians changing the names of street signs in different cities. They've thanked President Trump for speaking out because he's the only U.S. president to really stand on the side of the protesters. A lot of Iranians have grievances with President Barack Obama because he decided he was going to stay out during the 2009 post-election protests known as the Green Movement. There was a chant at the time that Obama, you're either with them or with us or with them being the Islamic Republic. So this really stood out to these anti-regime protesters. And then, of course, the subsequent massacre happened. And now with communications relatively back online, you've been hearing from some voices inside Iran and in the diaspora, including Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi, calling for R2P, or responsibility to protect, because what happened was crimes against humanity, an act of crimes against humanity. And so some people, because of what they've witnessed, are calling for that intervention, this expectation, because the president himself has opened that box. And so just looking at history for a minute, we saw George H.W. Bush do a similar thing after the Persian Gulf War in 1991. And the Iraqi Kurds and Shias rose up and they were slaughtered by Saddam Hussein. So he's kind of created this situation himself to an extent, I would say.
I get it that if you're in Iran under this repressive regime and there is a silver bullet, a foreign intervention is going to come in and rescue you, and you're going to live in a very different Iran, who wouldn't take that when you're so desperate? I get it on a human level, but I look at it and I kind of put President Trump's remarks in the context of the fact that I think is pretty well known, at least here in Washington, D.C., United States does not have an Iran policy. Certainly nothing that's that comprehensive. It's focused on a couple of issues. It's the nuclear issue, it's the missiles, maybe what Iran does in the region. In that case, we actually tend to react as opposed to have a comprehensive policy. So when you're out there saying, take the institutions, are you suggesting to Iranians you have a plan? Because I don't think the president had a plan. The best thing he could come up with was to put 25% tariff on countries that trade with Iran. That's not a plan. Fundamentally, again, I hate to sound cynical, and I think a lot of Americans probably agree with this. These people in Iran in 1979 brought their Shah down. They made a strategic, catastrophic mistake, but it's their burden, essentially, to get rid of it. The United States might be able to help one day. We're not there yet, or the rest of the world for that matter. In the meantime, it's the duty of the Iranians in Iran, in the opposition, to get together, organize, put the regime under pressure. This idea of kinetic action is going to magically turn things around. It's not going to happen. If you have a moment where people from the regime starts defecting, that could be a game changer. But to do that, you need to show them the time of this regime is up and there is an alternative really waiting on the sidelines. And that alternative right now is missing, other than what people are hoping for in the abstract. So
there's been a lot of news, and as we're recording this, it's really kind of unclear what's going to be happening right now in terms of negotiations. There were originally plans for a multilateral meeting in Istanbul, and then apparently the Iranians wanted a bilateral meeting in Oman. So what are you watching for in terms of the potential for negotiations over the next, say, couple of weeks?
So there would be 3 elements. Where is it? Who's at the table? And what are you discussing? And as we're speaking, none of those things are clear. The U.S. and Iran under the Trump administration's second term had 5 rounds of negotiations, largely conducted indirectly in Oman and Rome. They were, I think, further apart by the 5th round than they were at the first round. And that was when you only had the nuclear file on the table. And this issue that's dogged diplomacy for 23 years when it comes to the nuclear file, which is this question of domestic enrichment. on Iranian soil. The Trump administration, by the fifth rounds, their position was there can be no domestic enrichment. Iran's position was we must have the right to enrich.
The U.S. position didn't start out that way.
That's why I specifically said
one of the reasons was the negotiations didn't work out. Obviously negotiating with the Iranian regime is always tricky and fraught, but one of the reasons is the Trump administration kept changing what it would accept and sent a real estate developer instead of a negotiating team.
I mean, one difference now is that at least theoretically, that issue has been resolved in the sense that Iran has been at zero enrichment since June. So you can see a formula where Iran and the U.S. agree to some kind of declaration of principles where the U.S. says we recognize Iran's right to enrich in principle under the NPT, but Iran says in practice, given that we are in a moratorium on enrichment, that can be extended. That's a conceptual way that you can get around this at this point. But this comes to the second and third elements that are key to the negotiations, which is who's at the table. And originally, this was supposed to be a multilateral arrangement. The Iranians asked for a bilateral arrangement. Now it's unclear whether there'll be any arrangement at all. But since June, the U.S. has expanded the parameters beyond nuclear, which, again, they hadn't agreed on in the first place. But you can look at them as anywhere between 2 and 5 conditions, depending on which U.S. official is laying them out. President Trump has said nuclear and protesters. Special Envoy Witkoff has said nuclear, and that covers 2 different elements. Where's the fissile material? And what is the future of Iranian enrichment? So that's on the nuclear side. Limits to Iran's ballistic missile program and Iran's support for proxies, non-state allies in the region. So if you take them as broad categorizations, it would be nuclear, ballistic missile, regional, and internal. And the Iranians have said, we will only consider nuclear, and that nuclear is something that they hadn't come to a compromise in the first place. And I think that the U.S. view is that Iran is, by every metric, weaker right now than it was in June. It is economically weaker. It is weaker in terms of its social and political legitimacy at home. Its air defenses are non-existent. And if your approach is using, the maximum pressure policy as leverage, this is the moment where the U.S. has accumulated every bit of leverage it has. It has economic, political, diplomatic, and military. And at this point, at the time that we're speaking, that has not yet prompted the Iranians to back down on their red lines.
I think what really stands out to me is that in this moment where there's a quote unquote armada in the region and all this international attention and this weakness we've been discussing from all aspects, that the Iranians are making all these demands. And I know that that's been part of their playbook, the saber rattling.
So do you think they view themselves as weak or strong?
I think that it's neither. I think what's really going on is that they think that their playbook has kept them in power for 47 years and that it's going to keep them that way. And for me, I keep harping on about this over and over again, is that these guys haven't adjusted to the post-October 7th world dynamics. Like, you look at everything they've been yes, they're in power still. They've managed to survive the 12-day war and all that, but it's brought them to their knees practically in this moment. And if they don't approach this issue with a bit more pragmatism in this moment, they're going to be doomed for conflict or collapse or both, because they don't have the cards, but yet they're playing like they've got a full deck and that they're going to be able to outwit the United States in this moment, especially a president as mercurial as Donald Trump, who I like, they keep mouthing off on social media. And I'm like, that's what's going to get you starting a war with him.
Supposedly it was Maduro dancing that triggered Trump to launch the attack, although who knows if that's true.
Yeah, so I think that's a real thing, and they don't seem to understand that. And that to me is just really surprising, because I know that they have some people at the top that have studied in the West, that speak English, that have sat across these Western officials over the years. And it seems like anything that's being communicated is just not being paid attention to. And that's because of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who's, I would say, a cantankerous old man, like many of our grandfathers are.
But just to sharpen that point, and, Ania, you can jump in on this. We talked about this before we started recording. But, for me, looking at it as someone outside Iran, it just seems like Iran has 2 bad choices. It can either compromise much more than it would have fathomed doing in the past, or it can go to war, or it can strike some sort of deal and cheat, which it would probably also be willing to do. But these are not good options. But you were saying that that's not necessarily how the regime views it. Or you don't know, but you surmise.
I think that they think they can just amble along. They're a zombie regime at this point. I think one of our colleagues has described it in the past. Like they've metamorphosized. They've survived all these 7 or 8 U.S. administrations, and they think they can just amble along. But that ambling along is dragging down 90 million people with it. And it's come to a point where after this massacre, they've crossed a line of no return. Like we're now entered Syria 2011 right now. And I don't think you could really go back to the way things were. The trust between the people has been gone for a long time, but now it's been permanently severed. People are not going to, there's nothing that this regime could do to convince people that that it should stay at this point. And I think that that's something that the international community needs to recognize in this moment after the atrocities that we're still understanding the I would say volume at this juncture.
I just would point out, if you're sitting in the regime's shoes right now, and if this regime falls, what's going to happen to you? I mean, put all the ideology and all the fancy policy options aside. This is about potentially these people who are in the regime right now being caught and executed at some point by whoever's going to take over. There's a genuine sense of fear. They're fighting for their survival, and they have every right to do. I mean, revenge is something that's real. It runs across Iranian history. People will not forget what this regime has done for the last 47 years. So that is one of the motivating factors. I bet you a good part of the regime, the rank and file, know that this is not going to work out well in the long term, but they don't have another alternative. And if the regime just falls, they genuinely fear for their own well-being and that of their family. So again, to a point I made earlier, if you're in the Iranian opposition, in diaspora, in Iran, or United States, giving that sense of that there's a day after for those of you without blood on their hands, if you want to, leave this regime, that might not be a bad policy option. Khamenei's not in the streets doing the killing. Somebody else is doing that. How do you peel those people off? And I just say this one thing about the Iranian regime in terms of the talks. I was reading an article analysis by the Revolutionary Guards just a few hours ago. Here's what they were saying. The Americans attacked us with the Israelis during the 12-day war, didn't bring the regime down. The Europeans introduced snapback in September, more sanctions, all the rest of it didn't hurt us that much. And by the way, they include what happened with the protest movement as an extension of the 12-day war. Again, that psyche that they have where they think Iranian protesters are all sort of agents of foreigners. So in their mind, everything that the United States has tried has failed, and they have survived. So what's the worst thing that could happen if these talks fail to produce anything? In their mind, because Trump is who he is, he's not interested in protracted war. The worst thing I think they're gambling is, yes, maybe some missile production facilities are going to be hit this time as well, on top of the nuclear sites or some IRGC bases, but it's going to be limited because, 1 acre of carrier doesn't mean you're going to invade a country of 90 million people. This is not 1991. The U.S. is not preparing the masses of there's an armada, but it's not enough to occupy Iran. So essentially, you're still dealing with, at the worst case scenario, U.S. Air Force hitting you a number of times, and then the president declares victory, move on, and Iran can learn to live with that. But again, the regime still doesn't have a long-term plan. That's just buying time for the sake of buying time.
One question from me before I turn it over to Carrie for our final question. And I've just seen some social media posts about this. I don't know how true it is, but I know this is something that you three follow more closely. I've started seeing reports, unverified reports, of the Iranians took to the streets. They were killed, suppressed, jailed. Some have started actually fighting back in terms of organizing attacks on Basij units. Have you seen any of this that's credible or no?
I would say that is perfectly aligned with what the regime always comes out to say. I mean, I haven't seen reports, assessments that I'm comfortable with to live with in terms of weapons suddenly being introduced. Some of these Iranian opposition groups like the Kurds that, are Iranian ethnic Kurds, but they live in northern Iraq. They are known to be armed. So some armed elements might have been there. But I look at the totality of this protest movement and the idea that this was some, manufactured crisis that was put on the regime by outsiders. I don't buy into that argument.
I didn't mean it in that way. I just meant Iranian people trying to find a different way to fight back.
Well, this is not a country where you have small arms like Yemen or somewhere else. So weapons are going to be shipped in. They have to be shipped in unless you're the regime or unless you're a regime insider who decide to defect and start shooting your own former comrades, which I haven't seen any evidence of.
I was just going to add, I know there's been some references to the death of security forces. I think the group Human Rights Activists in Iran noted there were a little over 200. But I think it's important to emphasize that slain protesters, their families have also been forced to sign letters saying that these were martyred members of the security forces in order to receive their bodies. So I think that that's really important to emphasize. And the clerical establishment itself, people like even Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has been using, I would say, Assad-era rhetoric, calling these protesters terrorists, ISIS. And the irony in all this, of course, is that the protesters themselves were just chanting, IRGC, you are Basij, IRGC, you are ISIS. So it's really unfortunate that I see this with Western academics and even some Western journalists leaning into this, I would say, pro-regime talking points that this is some fault of the U.S. and Israel and that they're foreign agents on the ground that are taking arms against the regime. But I've seen so much footage. I've read about the families. I've been not documenting, but following closely. Some of these, I would say overwhelmingly, these were Gen Z Iranians that had taken to the streets. And they literally were out there because they wanted a normal life, like much of the international community has. And to say that they're Mossad agents or CIA is just an insult to their dignity and their fight for freedom.
Well, and I think, of course, one of the big questions to come up next is what happens next? So if we're talking about potential collapse of the regime in some form and however that happens, now or in the future because of U.S. strikes or internal discontent, whatever it is, what might potentially come next? And I'll say I'm personally extremely skeptical about all the stuff about Reza Pahlavi, but perhaps you have a different view, or what else could be coming up? And I wonder if as part of that, one of you could maybe also address the issue of the ethnic minorities, such as the Kurds and the Balochs, and what their future role might be in Iran as well.
A transition of some sort is coming to the Islamic Republic. I mean, to a certain extent, it's a biological inevitability because of Ali Khamenei's age.
Did you hear that hot mic conversation between Putin and Xi about organ transplants? I don't know. This is real. I'm not making this up.
I'm not sure that has yet made it to Tehran, but I mean, he is an octogenarian. He has been in ill health for a long time. So, within the corridors of power, you can assume that there has been, certainly speculating from the outside, but a degree of palace intrigue over who would come after or what might come after in terms of a different arrangement. There are different power brokers within the system. There are different aspirants for people that would like to take over. But now you have the prospect of an unnatural death as well. But President Trump has directly, threatened Ali Khamenei in the past. The Israelis had him were hoping to have him in their sights during the June war. So you can have a scenario where it's a limited vacuum at the top and some sort of structured transition that people within the system have likely been planning/plotting for some time. But in the event of a conflict, you could also have a more significant vacuum at the top. I mean, the Israelis in June were targeting the entire National Security Council. President Pezeshkian was injured in that. So the bigger the vacuum is, the greater the amount of volatility that could result in a certain sense. Iran has only had one transition since the 1979 revolution, and that was with Khamenei taking over in 89. And so the prospect of either the man at the top, the system at the top, ornaments coming from outside, or a renewal of unrest from below, every one of them is something that could put the system, put the country in a very different trajectory.
I want to talk a little bit about the idea of where things can go. People always ask, where's the opposition? I always say that there's many Nelson Mandelas, but they're all in prison. And There's 2 Nobel laureates. One's in exile, Shirin Ebadi, and the other is Narges Mohammadi, who's currently incommunicado in Iran. There's been for some time a call for transition. Just recently, that was made in January, with Mohammadi being one of the leading voices and 17 others. But I think it's important to emphasize that former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi does have relevance in this moment. There were chants in the streets for chanting for his family name in different iterations. There was "Long live the Shah," "This is the last battle, Pahlavi will return."
Yeah, some people have countered, and a lot of them on the side of the regime and others who are just skeptical voices, that these weren't genuine videos, or it was just a few people and not a lot of footage was getting out of Iran, so selectively taped. Are you arguing that it's actually become more of a grassroots movement in Iran, the support for Pahlavi?
It's hard to say that in the age of AI, but I have to say that I have friends that work on AI in the Iran space, and much of the AI versions of those videos that were by the regime. The regime was trying to discredit what was happening on the ground, but it's undeniable that some of those protesters were not only making those chants, but that they were actually just holding signs. But that being said, it doesn't mean that necessarily every single person chanting the Pahlavi name wants Reza Pahlavi to be the transitional leader that he's offered himself. Some of them see them that pre-1979 was a better time in Iran, and chanting his name was arguably a form of even trolling the Islamic Republic. But that being said, I don't think we can ignore that the regime has made it to the point that people felt the need to chant his name because they haven't had any options inside the country. And so they had to look outside. And frankly, this isn't the first time we've had that happen. We had somebody named Khomeini sneak in audio tapes, and he got on a flight from Paris to Tehran, an Air France flight. So it's not unprecedented in Iranian history that somebody from the outside would come in. But I think we really should pay attention to that, because it's not just some guy that has not been back for 47 years. It's because there's an institutional legacy and people that are genuinely, to an extent, calling for him. The numbers, that could be decided in a free and fair election, of course, but I think we can't ignore that there were actual people inside the country going out. And I think just one last thing that I didn't say, the reason that the numbers were so high on January 8th, which prompted the communications shutdown, was because he made a call on January 6th telling people to go out. And even his fiercest critics, even in the diaspora, back that call, and people inside Iran, not necessarily that he leads, but a call for freedom and democracy. So I think we shouldn't be ignoring his impact on the protests in this moment.
I agree with Nasim and Holly in terms of Islamic Republic has to go through a transition one way or another. I wouldn't necessarily say the death of Khamenei is imminent. His father lived to almost 100 and he could be around for another 10 years. That's not a good U.S. policy option to wait for his death. If you really do care about the urgency of this matter, the Iran file, and U.S. has since 1979, it's about time the United States started actually kind of thinking what it is it wants. Is it just a nuclear issue? Then say so, because it kind of clears for the opposition where they stand vis-a-vis the United States and its power. This notion that they're going to come to the streets because the Americans are going to save them, they're going to put that aside and start thinking alternative ways of bringing the regime down. So I think you can do that. You can also help the Iranian regime in their calculations. They might actually give the United States a better nuclear deal if they felt regime change really isn't what the U.S. is interested in. Because right now, their thinking in Tehran is the Americans are going to ask for concessions on the nuclear front. Tomorrow's the missiles. The day after, they want us to recognize Israel. Then the next thing you know, we're going to be a country that any air force in the region can come and bomb whenever they want, and we're helpless. So there are things U.S. can do in clarifying what U.S. policy on Iran is. Unfortunately, I don't see any signs of that in this town, which surprises me because, again, Iran's been a pain in the neck for half a century for this country. And the fact that it becomes a partisan issue, that Democrats, Republicans are so divided in terms of what to do with Iran, it shows to me that the intellectual seriousness by which this matter needs to be tackled isn't there. But I would also, just final word, when I look at Iran and its immediate 15 neighbors, I can't point to one country that has struggled for political freedoms as much as Iran. They had a constitutional revolution in 1905. No country in Asia can claim that, right? Or even many countries in Europe can. So this desire for political representation and the rights being respected, it's part of the Iranian DNA. This is what this country wants. They got it badly wrong in 79. They didn't want theocracy. They wanted democracy. They're going to get to another point where Islamic Republic will go. Who helps them? How to get there remains to be seen. But I have no doubt they want to change.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast, and thank you to Victus Technologies for sponsoring this episode. Learn more about the exciting work that Victus is doing for autonomy at warontherocks.com/Victus, that's Victus. Stay safe and stay healthy.